Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, Truman and Civil Rights. It's being presented to us by the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we put on every year from January through April. This is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that students and teachers can access them later. All right, we absolutely want you to participate today. It's a lot more fun that way. So if you haven't already, go ahead and pull up your chat box. That'll be the easiest way to ask questions today. Go ahead and share where you're joining us from if you'd like to. You can also be on video. If that is something you're interested in, go ahead and leave me a message and I will help you with it. Again, participate as much as possible. It's a lot more fun that way. That said, just be really respectful of our interactive tools. We want to make sure any questions we're asking, any comments we're making, that they're directly related to what our presenter is speaking about today. All right, and just want to thank you one more time. We're so glad to have you. This is our website. If you're interested in more information about our program or you're looking for links to our recordings, you can find all that information there. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass you over to Mark, who you came to see.
Good afternoon, everybody. At least afternoon for me in Central Time Zone. Some of you, I guess, might still be in the morning. I see we have somebody from Appomattox. If you want to continue to share your location, that's always fun to know. So you can do that. Michigan comes in, Kennedy Elementary. Thank you. We are covering all the states with these programs, so it's exciting to find out where people are from. We will be using the chat box for interaction. So as I ask questions or pose things to think about, we'll be using the chat box for that. So getting used to using that is really helpful. And then at the end, we'll certainly open up for questions as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. And there we go. So you can see the full screen there. So we're going to be talking this afternoon about President Truman and civil rights. I am Mark Adams, Museum Curator here at the Library Museum. I'm at the library today. I'm not actually sitting on our exhibits, but this is a photo of one of our exhibits that I'm using behind me as my backdrop from Truman's Oval Office from 1950. Today, we are focusing on civil rights, and we'll be going through some of that. As we go along, as I said, I'll be asking for you to think about some things and maybe post some things in the chat as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. So what Truman is most known for civil rights, we're going to look at this key document, and then we're going to go back and see how this document comes about, kind of the history behind this landmark executive order that Truman issues in July of 1948. I should say as an aside, when the National Archives was asked a number of years ago to feature 100 documents in United States history, this was one of the documents they chose. It's that important. But it's one that maybe a lot of people don't necessarily know a lot about. Usually when they think of civil rights in the United States, they usually gravitate towards the 1960s and the actions of President Johnson and the actions of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and others. But we're going to go back a little bit further into the 1940s and see one of the first actions related to civil rights coming right after World War II, and that is this executive order. And these executive orders always have numbers. This particular one, Executive Order 9981. And why this was so important is that not only does it establish a committee on equality and opportunity in the armed services, but it also commits the United States to integrate what was previously a segregated armed forces, all branches of the military, not just the Army, not just the Navy, but all branches of the military were ordered to integrate the troops. Just as a quick aside, and we'll go into more of this detail a bit later on, during World War II, while we are fighting Nazi Germany, who are practicing racist policies against Jews and others in Europe, American troops fighting in that war were fighting as segregated forces. So after World War II, there was a huge push towards integration. Truman takes care of that in the summer of 1948. So our program today is really to look at how does this come about? What are the motivations of President Truman and others to make sure this happens? Kind of what I always like to ask in history, why then, why now? Why in that particular moment in the summer of 1948 did Truman decide to do this? Why didn't he go to Congress? Why did he use an executive order? Things like that. And we've got some other questions we'll be posing along the way. However, we're going to start first with a cartoon. Some of you have attended some of my presentations in the past. Know I'm a big advocate of using political cartoons to help students study history. For one, they're visual. Two, they're open for interpretation. And I think they lend themselves to great discussion. So I want everybody to take a look at this cartoon. And my question for you today is, what do you notice in this cartoon? So what do you notice in this cartoon? Anything at all? Go ahead and add that to the chat, and then we'll talk about the cartoon that's in front of you. So what do you notice in the cartoon? Go ahead and add to the chat box. So an older woman asking Truman if he'd rather be right than president. Excellent. What else do you notice? And that was from Kennedy Elementary. Thank you. Civil rights in the ground. Yeah. Civil rights written around Truman's feet. Jay Service says he did what he thought was right and didn't worry about it if he would get reelected. Excellent. What else do you notice? You guys have got the main points already. Any other details that you might notice? The lady's hat says Miss Democracy. I was just about to ask if anyone noticed that in kind of what looks like a feather. Miss Democracy. Very good. Pose a question for you. Sometimes when we look at visual images like cartoons or photographs or even written documents, we have to make inferences. We kind of have to jump to some conclusions. And maybe it's more of an opinion, but I want you to make an inference today, so it's a good skill to learn. What part of the country do you think the lady represents? So that might be a tricky question, and it might be a little bit of a stereotype, but can you think about what part of the country might the lady represent in the 1940s? As we are looking at the 1940s today. Old Southerners, great job, Jay Service. And then Kennedy Elementary also says the South. Maybe that question wasn't as hard as it seemed, but you guys made a great inference. We don't know that for certain, but certainly by the style of dress, the kind of the fluffy skirt and the umbrella and the long gloves and even the hat might indicate that she's maybe from the South. And that was an important group that we're going to be discussing today. Voters, men and women in the South, that were previously supporters of the Democratic Party, what we called the Southern Democrats, were very upset about Truman's actions towards civil rights. And as you've mentioned, the lady says to President Truman, "You'd rather be right than president." So what is she implying there? What is she implying by saying you'd rather be right than president? What do you think she's saying? Now, remember that when this cartoon takes place and the idea of civil rights under Truman, it's in 1948. It's a presidential election year. He's due to have an election in November of 1948. Could threaten his reelection. Yes, exactly. He might lose votes. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the southern states tended to vote Democratic. We see the opposite today. This is one of the changing points, actually, in the political landscape, where we see the southern states start to shift away from the Democrats and towards the Republicans, but not quite yet. But there is a threat that he might lose those southern states if he goes forward with this civil rights program. So Then what about what Truman says? That's an unusual phrase we don't see very often. I stand pat. Her name isn't Pat, so that's a bit confusing. What do you think that means? And this is a tricky one. What do you think that means? I stand pat. Proud, possibly. What else might it mean? Kind of a tricky one. Firm. Firm's a good analogy or a good synonym. Yeah, I stand firm. He's going to stand for civil rights. He's on the mat there of civil rights. It can be determined. So another synonym might be stubborn or standing his ground. So standing firm certainly works. So he's standing for civil rights and he's not going to budge, if that's a good way to describe that. He's going to be stubborn about it, and that's his position, and he's going to stick with it. And if you know President Truman like I do, one of his character traits is he could be pretty stubborn. Once he made up his mind, it was hard to change his mind. So let's look at some of the background of this. You guys did a wonderful job participating there. So I just encourage that going forward. So let's look now at Truman's background, because when historians have looked at this decision, integrate the military, and there's another piece he integrates too, we'll talk about a bit later on, they are sometimes puzzled because when they look at his background, he certainly doesn't look like a progressive who's going to embrace civil rights in the 1940s, 20 years before we get civil rights legislation from Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. So when we look back at his time, we really don't see that in his background. In fact, we see the opposite. So he's born in the 1880s. As you know, the Civil War ends in 1865, so just 19 years after the end of the Civil War, which meant his parents and his grandparents were all alive during the Civil War. So very fresh in their memory. And Harry Truman grew up of stories about the Civil War. Now, I know some of the people in other states might not realize this, but Kansas and Missouri were very heavily involved in the Civil War even before it began. There were border conflicts between Kansas, which was a free state, and Missouri, which was a slave state, in the 1850s. Kansas becomes a state in 1861, so right at the time that the Civil War is beginning. And really, war is broken out, essentially, between Kansas and Missouri. It's that bad. The city of Lawrence, Kansas is raided, and hundreds of people are killed. And then the Union forces retaliate and raid places in Jackson County, Missouri, which is where Kansas City and Independence, Missouri, Truman's hometown, are located. So there's lots of fights back and forth. And then there are Civil War battles that come in from the east as well. So there's kind of wars in both sides of the greater Kansas City area, both on the eastern side in Independence and on the west, crossing Kansas and Missouri state lines. Truman's family, being in Missouri, were Southern sympathizers. Both sets of his grandparents on both sides, both his mother's side and his father's side, his grandparents owned slaves. That was not unusual in Missouri in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. And so, as a son of essentially Southern sympathizers, racial language that we would describe today was used by Truman, by his family, in their letters and in their communications. One very important point to remember, during the 1860s, during the Civil War, Truman's mother's family were actually interred and relocated by the Union Army. People in this area in Jackson County, Missouri, where I'm sitting today in Independence, they're to declare loyalty to the Union. And if they didn't, they would be punished and their land taken away. Truman's mother's family refused to do that. Their property was taken over, some of it destroyed, and they were relocated unless they would swear oath to the Union, which they refused to do. So it was a very troublesome time and left harsh feelings towards the Union and the Northern cause for generations, not just in the Truman family, but across the whole area of this part of Missouri that I'm located in today. His mother in particular lived longer in life, and what Truman described in these three quotes as being an unconstructed rebel. Now, we don't know about his father, what his long-term view would have been, because he died in 1914. And so we don't really know if his views would have changed or not, but his mother certainly did not, and neither did his grandparents. And so you can see three quotes there. In particular, his mother did not like Abraham Lincoln, who was, the champion of freeing the slaves and so forth. And we know that history. And in fact, when she visited him in the White House, she refused to stay in the Lincoln bedroom. Another story is that when Truman was in the National Guard in 1906, 5 years after he graduated high school, he came home in a blue National Guard uniform, and she immediately was upset with him and told him to take it off and not to bring that to the house again, because a blue uniform was associated with the Union Army. He wasn't representing the Union Army, he was just in the National Guard, but she just couldn't abide that uniform being in the house. And this is 1906, almost 40 years after the end of the Civil War, that it held that deeply in her mind. So she remained unreconstructed, is what Truman described his mother. Well, we're all influenced by our parents in many ways. So you can see her influence on Truman's opinion might be very strong as he grows up into adulthood. Truman, though, had a life-changing experience in 1917, 18, and 19. He serves in World War I. He was actually too old for the draft, but he volunteers. And so he goes off to fight at the age of 33 in World War I. He's actually the only president to serve in combat in World War I. So he's kind of unique. He does not have a college degree, but he does volunteer for the Army. Prior to that, he was a farmer here in Grandview, Missouri, just south of Independence. And he's dating his future wife at that time as well. So this widens his experience some, although there are no African Americans in his unit, in his Battery D. All of the African soldiers that fought in World War I, and there were thousands and thousands of African American soldiers, they usually served under French command because we still had segregated military. So that's hard to think about. They were not allowed to serve in the US military, so they served under French command. So they could serve in integrated units alongside the French soldiers. So they did not serve alongside Truman. So in Truman's unit of 198 men, they were all whites. Now, he did befriend a Jew, Eddie Jacobson, who was Jewish, and they actually became very good friends and went into business together later on in the 1920s. But Truman's experience in terms of African Americans at the front was rather limited because they were in different sectors in the war. But Truman does get promoted to captain, has a leadership role, and sees some of the world. He's in France, he's in training in Oklahoma, he's in training in New York City, he's in training in Western France, and ultimately he's at the front towards the end of the war in 1918, and comes home in 1919 and gets married with a somewhat broader perspective. Most of his Battery D was what he was in charge of, were Irish Catholics. He was a Baptist. So again, he's beginning to be exposed to different religions, different cultures through his Eddie Jacobson friend, who's Jewish and so on, but not really African Americans, I have to say. So we've got questions that I'd like you to think about. Some of these questions you might think of as units for the classroom later, points of debate, things to discuss, things to examine, maybe one of the questions, or maybe all of them through a group activity. But these are some of the things to think about when you're thinking about what Truman does to integrate the military. And he actually integrates the federal workforce as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So the first question to think about, and these are not to answer right now, but just to consider at the top of the page, how did this executive order come about? Why did it come about? And then the second question is a follow-up from that. What reasons did Truman have for issuing this order? We've seen his background, seems rather Southern, not in favor of civil rights in his family. What reasons did Truman have for even issuing this order to integrate the military in the first place? 1948 was when this took place in July. In November is an election year. So that's the third question to think about. Did the fact that it was an election year make any difference? Did he do this to get votes? As we saw from the cartoon at the beginning, that lady thought he would lose votes because he would lose the Southern votes. So that would be something he would have to weigh. Was he swayed by public pressure? Any president in any era, from George Washington to President Biden, every president gets public pressure to do things. Whether the president pays attention to that public pressure varies by president and varies by issue. But there was lots of public pressure put on President Truman. Or as some historians like to think, Truman converted. He was a Southerner, really not really for civil rights in his early life. But by the time he became president and things were revealed to him about some things that were happening to African Americans across the country, he converted to that cause. Which of these are true? Which of these, these are all different points of debate that you could think about, build a lesson around, or even just discuss in the classroom. So lots of things to consider with this issue, which I think makes it exciting and makes it something you can really look into a little bit more after the presentation. So some of these, what is this decision based on? Is it based on his principles? He wants civil rights. He wants integration in the military for principled reasons. Was it circumstances? Were circumstances so bad that it really demanded action? You have to do something. So not necessarily planned out, but something happened that made him act as quickly as possible. Was there some kind of morality involved? Was something happening that affect his moral viewpoint? Was he getting political advice from his aides? Were they saying, hey, we need to do this? It might help us in the election, or other reasons? One that doesn't usually come up with presidential decisions, but sometimes it does, is this idea that there's pressure from other countries. Was outside influence saying, hey, we need to do this, makes us all look better as allies, or something like that. And then the last one we just mentioned, public pressure. Was that a big influence on the decisions that he was making? So again, all things to us to think about. And I'm going to dig in and look at some of these for the remainder of the presentation. So in terms of principle, when we talk about principle, we're talking about, does Harry Truman have any kind of track record for doing something like this in civil rights? Or is it just completely out of the blue? Can we kind of see what he'd done in the past? And did that lend us to think that he was principled, he was continuing a policy that he agreed with? Well, based on some of the things written on this slide, you might think that he did have some principles, that he was acting out on things he'd already supported. So prior to becoming president, of course, President Truman was a vice president for about 3 months before Franklin Roosevelt died. And prior to that, he was US Senator from Missouri for 10 years, so a long time in the Senate. During that time, we could look at his voting record. What did he vote for? What did he stand for? What were his principles? So one of those, he was very much in support of the New Deal proposed by FDR. He voted to fund what's something you might not have heard of, but we're going to talk a little bit about today, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which really, if you look at the name of that, Fair Employment Practices, it was really to help employment for everybody in society, including African Americans. So African American groups were very much in favor of what we call FEPC. May not have heard of it before, but in the 1940s and 1950s, it's incredibly important because it really helps protect minorities as they try to get employment so they can't be discriminated against. One of the things that was very prevalent at that time in voting was that different states had different rules. They still do to a large degree, but some states had what we call a poll tax. So when you go to vote, you go to the polls, and you actually had to pay to vote. Well, if you're of lower income and you go to vote and you can't afford it, that would discourage you from voting. African Americans tended to be on the lower social strata in terms of wages because of discrimination, and they wouldn't necessarily be able to vote because they couldn't afford it. So Truman voted for anti-poll tax legislation to get rid of this poll tax. He also voted anti-lynching legislation, which is just horrific. Murdering of African Americans by hanging them from trees, just awful. And at that point, there was not legislation against that. So Truman voted for all four of these things, which did further the cause of African Americans. So, in some ways, looking at his record as a senator, he seems to have a track record of supporting African American causes. However, when we look at his own words, there's quite the contrast. So, if we look at the text on the left and then we look at the text on the right, let's examine this for a moment. Take a look at the text on the left and then take a look at the text on the right in the black and type in the chat what you think the differences are. Both of these are quotes by Harry Truman. So what do you think the differences are in these two quotes from President Truman? They're not necessarily when he's president, but during his lifetime. Any contrasts there that you find? Take some time to read it. And then any comments you want to put that anything you see as a contrast, go ahead and put that in the chat. Now it takes a few minutes to read and then to type. Okay, the right text is hinting towards supporting people not having to hire Black people. That's true. What else? On the left, he seems more concerned with equality. Excellent. Anything else? You're right there. On the right, seems to argue for segregation. Great job. Really well noticed. This is hard to read the text that you've never seen before. Any last comment about this? Let's look at the first two paragraphs on the right, because I think that sums it up the best. He talks about political equality and economic equality, regardless of race, creed, or color. So no segregation there, no discrimination. But then the second paragraph is more troubling. When it comes to social matters, a man has a right to pick his associates. So if he doesn't want somebody at his house, he doesn't want them there. Or if he doesn't have to go to parties, if he doesn't approve of them. So he's making a distinction between political equality, economic equality, but not social equality. Now, that's a troubling thing to read. Let me see what Hazley Elementary has to say. The left says free men, even Black men, are entitled to something better than segregation or racism. Exactly right. So they don't quite line up, do they? It's confusing. And that makes historians' job harder because they look at these quotes and they have to try and reconcile them. So on the one hand, you're talking about equality, but on the other hand, you don't want to hang out with somebody. You don't want to be seen in a social situation with somebody who's not of the same color of skin or something like that. So I just wanted to point that out to be really honest about Truman's own quotes kind of contradict one another. And so that's something we just have to weigh in when we look at some of the things that he does. And we'll get back to that at the end when we look at some criticisms of Truman and civil rights as well. So let's look at the context. You guys did a great job with that. That was a tough one. Does he ever address the difference in these opinions? Really, what he stands by is this idea of, yes, everybody can have politically equal, economically equal, but in his mind, he separates out the social side. It's hard to reconcile today in today's society, but that was kind of as far as he got, I suppose, in terms of moving from where his parents and grandparents were to, I will give them political equality, the vote, integration of the military, and so on. But when it comes to hanging out with a group of friends, they're not included. That was as far as he got, I suppose, in terms of a swing towards civil rights. Very hard to reconcile in today's society. But those quotes are there, they're historical evidence. Primary sources for the Presidential Primary Sources Project that we've examined. So this is just some of the background out of World War II. The civil rights movement of the 1940s, which people are not as familiar with, and while we're talking about it today, really the roots of it come from World War II. The war has ended. African American soldiers have fought overseas for equality, against Nazism, against racial policies. But when they come home to a segregated society. So we look at some of the numbers there. About 10% of the population at 1940 was African American, almost a million African American veterans, and more than a million were inducted into the armed services before the end of 1945. So the numbers speak for themselves. About a million people had served in the military prior to the end of 1945. In terms of what FDR had done and preceding Truman, as I said, they've been fighting racist and fascist regimes in Europe. Many African Americans in the war effort, about a million, as I said, came home thinking they'd bettered themselves, they'd proved themselves in battle, they'd been honored with medals and so forth, and they would have expected better treatment when they come home. Very similarly to African Americans that fought in World War I, but nothing changed after World War I. And there was a large push to make sure there were changes after World War II. And so this Fair Employment Practices Commission that I mentioned earlier, that Truman voted for, did allow African Americans to get into job training programs, in defense plants, forbidding discrimination by contractors and so forth. So there was a step in the right direction, but certainly a long way to go. So that's what faced Truman when he came into office. By 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, we noticed that the military has enforced a 10% ceiling for officers. So if you might be doing well and you would expect to be promoted, but often the African American personnel were used as deckhands or cooks in the Navy. They got all the grunt jobs and never were promoted. Very little opportunity to be promoted to be an officer or to be in a leadership position. However, surveys that done said that African Americans had performed very well in combat, that with the same training, they could perform just as well as white soldiers. So that was kind of some of the statistics coming out of the war. Unfortunately, one of the incidences, we talked about morality earlier. One of the areas of morality that comes home to Truman is the treatment of this soldier who's pictured on this slide, Isaac Woodard. He came home from World War II in uniform, and while he's in uniform, he's brutally attacked and blinded in South Carolina. Taken off the back of a bus, he has to go to the restroom. There's a disagreement, and the city marshal and sheriff beat him to the point where he's blinded for the rest of his life. This becomes a national case. It becomes front page news, even more so when the guilty parties were actually all found not guilty by an all-white jury. So Truman is enraged by that. And that's in the February of 46. And then in July of 1946, 2 African Americans and their 2 wives were taken from their cars, and they were all 4 of them were killed. They were murdered. And one of the wives was 7 months pregnant. So just horrific incidents. These are just 2 examples. There's many, many more. Many examples of African Americans in uniform being murdered or injured severely. Now remember, I mentioned World War I earlier. President Truman was a veteran himself. He'd served in combat in World War I, the only president to do so. So when he heard about the treatment of veterans, this is when we look at morality. Do the circumstances, do the morality really get to him that the treatment of these patriotic soldiers who'd helped win World War II are being treated this way? And then the injustice of an all-white jury finding the perpetrators not guilty. So he's horrified by these incidences that come to his attention. So there's some of the quotes attributed to Truman at that time. He says on the first one, "My very stomach turned over when I learned that soldiers just back from overseas were being dumped out of army trucks in Mississippi and beaten. And whatever my inclination as a native Missourian might have been, as president, I know this is bad. I shall fight to end evils like this. Let's look at that second quote. I find the second quote really fascinating. What does he mean when he says, whatever my inclination as a native of Missouri might have been? Yeah, and you've asked that question. You seem thinks that it's strange, referencing a difference between the president and a native Missourian. So what that is strange, I think, too. Spring Lake Middle School, I believe that is. What does he mean by that? How do you interpret that, do you think? How do we resolve this strangeness? What does he mean by that? It seems like the concern about the treatment of humans would be the same regardless of the viewpoint. I agree. It's very, very difficult to look through this through the lens of the 21st century. It's very hard to think back on the viewpoints in the 1940s and earlier, and even viewpoints around the Civil War. So what does he mean by this native of Missouri? My inclination as a native of Missouri. He knows as president, it's his duty to avoid all prejudice he might have grown up with. You know, Jay Service, that's a really good summary. I like that a lot. He might mean as a southern state who don't support racial equality. Excellent. So I think those last two comments, I'm going to read Jay Services again. It's very, very good. He knows as president, it's his duty to avoid all prejudice he might have grown up with. He grew up with that, and he has to put it to one side. That's his inclination, I suppose. And then he might mean a southern state who don't support racial equality or racial equity, excuse me. And that's right. Missouri was a southern state. That's where he grew up. And he actually was born in southern Missouri and moves to Independence, which is a little bit more in the northwest part of the state. But either way, he's got this contradiction in his own mind. As a native of Missouri, I might think one thing, but as president, I have to fight this. In a way, I guess we should be grateful he does realize he has to fight for this and to end this kind of treatment. But it is a little troubling to read that he's still trying to shake off that background that he grew up with. So really great observation. So thank you. At least he can recognize his own prejudice. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to summarize that. Again, it's troubling, but there we go. So one of the things that Truman does in 1946, after these two events and others, I should not say these are the only events, but those are the ones that got the most national attention. In December of 46, he issues an executive order, which is a committee on civil rights to look at how to strengthen and protect civil rights for all people. And a year later, that committee comes back with this report to secure these rights. And the whole report is on the Truman Library website, so you can look at it. It's long, but it is an incredible document that really lays the foundation for civil rights in the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s. Lyndon Johnson relied heavily on this document as it makes recommendations across all elements of society. In 1947, in the summer of 1947, Truman is the first United States president to speak to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we know today as the NAACP. And you see a quote from that speech there where he talks about freedom and equality to all our citizens. And he says, when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. And that's actually handwritten on the document. And you see a photo on the left of him addressing the NAACP at the Lincoln Memorial. So that's a landmark speech that he gives, and it starts to upset some of those Southern Democrats that we talked about at the beginning. So then we think about politics. Is he making this decision on integrating the military and the federal workforce due to politics? There's a presidential election in November of 1948. These executive orders are in July of 1948. So in a memo in the year before the election, 1947, one of his aides, Clark Clifford, and his colleague, James Rowe, present a memo to Truman arguing that civil rights would be a good issue to use in the election to gain African-American votes. There's lots of other things that memo goes into as well, but it is in there. It's historical record. So take a look at this cartoon. It's similar to the first one we looked at, but what do you notice in this cartoon? What do you notice in this cartoon? This is kind of a fun one, I think, in terms of its caricature and so forth. What do you notice in this cartoon? Anything at all? Wild is crossed out for mild. Yep. So instead of I'm wild about Harry or wild about you, Harry, it says I'm mild about you. Change in tone there. What else? It's from the Southern Democrats. So we talked about some. So they're threatening, threatening him. I'm not wild about you. And it is an election year. What else do you notice? Truman's playing the piano. And just as an aside, Truman was a very accomplished pianist. So he's often used by cartoonists as playing a piano or having a piano. He looks haggard. That's a really good definition. I like to use adjectives to describe faces and symbols in cartoons. Yes, he looks haggard. His hair's sticking up. He's kind of peeking over the top of his glasses. His nose is turned down. Yeah, very good. What else do you notice? Represents the Southern Democrats' disapproval of him. That's excellent, Spring Lake. So they disapprove of what he's doing. He's making these moves towards civil rights, and the Southern Democrats are disapproving of that. So when it comes to the 1948 presidential election, there's a real fear that the Southern Democrats are going to move away from supporting him. And that seems to be a big threat in an election year. So was it politics? Was he appealing to get African American votes? But at the same time, he's going to lose Southern Democrats. So it seems an odd strategy in political year. And we saw the cartoon at the beginning where the lady said, you might be right, but you won't be president because you're going to lose votes. So that one's one we need to wrestle with. So there's the same cartoon we used at the beginning. This party was actually called the States' Rights Party, and we're going to look at a poster of them in a minute. But their nickname was called the Dixiecrats. They were Democrats below the Mason-Dixon line. And it actually led in the election the Democrats losing Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. Those electoral college votes actually went to this new party. So the Republicans nor the Democrats won them. The Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats or States' Rights Party, actually won those in the 48 election. So that split in the party certainly damaged his election chances. And this is the poster that I referred to, the States' Rights Democrats or States' Rights Party. Their nickname, as I said, was the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. And so they were putting forward the idea of keeping the United States segregated across all forms of society, schools, military, and so on. Really, after the 1948 election, it kind of dwindled. They didn't do very well. They did get some electoral college votes. I'm going to think it was 39, somewhere in there. But as things moved forward, they dwindled in popularity. In fact, Strom Thurmond ends up switching to the Republican Party later in life. And really, those southern states through the 50s and Dwight Eisenhower start to shift towards the Republican Party rather than the Democratic Party, which they had been for most of the century. Some of the other issues that were put forward in this political memo, Truman needs to move left. Pressure groups will influence the vote rather than political machines. That Truman needed to court farmers, labor, progressive, northern blacks. So there it is in black and white to kind of appeal to them. To ignore the Southern protests. They can't pull out, and if they do, their loss will not affect Truman victory. That was a prediction that went wrong. The Southern Democrats did pull out, did form their own party, and did steal votes away. But Truman was able to win anyway. Foreign policy with bipartisan foreign policy, with the Republican and Democrats coming together, might come under stress. They voted for things like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, things like that. That might come under threat because there was cooperation behind those measures. And then Congress will not cooperate to pass your legislation. These were predictions that they had, and that part came true. The other part we need to think about is foreign countries, other countries that Truman's allied with, particularly the United Kingdom and France and others. So when the US would criticize the Soviet Union, and we're now in the Cold War by 1948, they would talk about Soviet Union taking over these Eastern European countries, not allowing them to have elections, things like that. And the Soviet Union would point straight back and say, don't talk to us about freedoms in Eastern Europe when you've got African Americans being murdered on the street in uniform. So that contradiction was a real problem. And the Americans were reminded by their allies, the UK, France, that this was embarrassing. And Truman admits that it's inconsistent with international commitments. And I really like this last quote: we could not endorse a color line at home and still expect to influence Asian and African peoples. So it was, and Kennedy Elementary points it out, very hypocritical. So that was part of the move towards civil rights, was maybe pressure from our foreign friends, from our allies in Europe, particularly. Public opinion was very strong. Truman receives letters from all walks of society about these issues and the proposals he's put forward. Probably the strongest voice comes from the NAACP and from A. Philip Randolph, who's the chairman of the Committee Against Jim Crow in Military Service and Training. He actually threatens to have African Americans refuse to be drafted in the next draft law. And so there's letters from all sides that come bombard Truman. Truman gets letters from children about this. The violence against the veterans that we talked about leads to large letter writing campaigns, and African American groups say they're going to refuse to enter the draft. So a real troubling time in terms of public pressure, public opinion, and that might have influenced him. Then what did he do? Well, he puts forward this program to secure these rights. So why is he having to use an executive order? That just made all these proposals. But when he tried to put that through in legislation, both the Southern Democrats and the Republicans blocked his legislation through Congress. So then he had to rely on using executive orders. Now, remember, the president can't just make an executive order on anything. He has to have executive authority. So seeing as he's the commander-in-chief, he's able to integrate the US forces because he's the leader of the military as commander-in-chief. And then because he's the head of state and the head of the federal government, he's also able to stop discrimination and integrate and start integration in the federal workforce, which is across the whole country. So if you think about integration at that time period, Brown v. Board of Education, which is passed in 1954 by the Supreme Court, is 6 years after this. So we don't get integrated schools till 1954. Most of the other civil rights legislation is passed in the 60s. But in 1948, he integrates the military and he integrates the federal workforce. We're going to come to your question, Hazley Elementary, I think on the next slide, or maybe the slide after that. So we will get there about the pushback. So he's able to use an executive order in those cases. Okay, let's move on and we'll get to your answer. So let's measure this, and then we'll look at the pushback on the desegregation order. So talk about pushback. First of all, he makes a speech at a joint session of Congress in February of 1948. With time, we didn't have time to look at that. The whole speech is online. You can read it, the transcript. 82% of the public opposed his civil rights proposals. So think about what we were talking about earlier, these contradictions. It's no surprise. 82% are against his civil rights proposals. Nobody had ever proposed civil rights in the Congress ever before. So it's a new thing, which is sad. He asked Congress to outlaw the poll tax. They deny it. They don't pass it. So his Committee on Civil Rights lays the foundation for future. It lays out the statistics for housing, poll tax, education, lynching, and puts forward all of this legislation. None of it is passed. 82%. Wow, says Hazley Elementary. Absolutely the right reaction. It's astonishing. His executive order does integrate the military. This is the slide that answers your question. Did he experience a lot of pushback? Yes, he did. Second bullet, the army was dragging its feet, really slow. And Truman had to kind of talk to the people in charge of the army and really push them to integrate. And this Committee on Equality of Treatment is the one that's pushing all branches of government. They want their plans, they want them to get the training programs domestically set up, and so forth. The federal workforce was integrated a lot quicker. There was a lot less pushback. And then in terms of Supreme Court justices, some of the ones that he put forward actually were the ones that favored the Brown v. Board decision in 1954. Just a fun fact, the Brown v. Board case started in 1948. It takes 6 years to get to the Supreme Court. So it's all part of the same decision making. And then he does appoint the first African-American judge, Judge Hasty, to the Third Court of Appeals. So some successes there. Comment from Kennedy seems like a brave thing to do in face of such opposition. I think that's the viewpoint today. Did he comment at all on Brown v. Board? He was in favor of it, and he put those justices there deliberately to help with that. Some of the negatives. It's important as historians that we look at things that didn't succeed or should have gone further, is a good way to put it. The Department of Justice Civil Rights section had only 6 attorneys for the whole country. So they relied on the FBI. The FBI only had 3 African-American nations for the entire country. So 13,000 complaints a year, about 20 a year acted upon. So nowhere near enough. The voting statistics are embarrassing. The poll taxes remained, so people had to pay to vote. And Mississippi and South Carolina had below 50% voting average. And in the Mississippi election of 1946, the midterms, you can see the figure there, 0.001% African Americans were able to vote. So most of that is due to the poll tax, but also intimidation at the polls, where people were threatened or killed if they tried to vote. So just a horrific situation. And then just to wrap things up, I've got 2 contrasting opinions. One is from Carol Anderson, who's African-American professor at Emory University in Atlanta. And while she says, and her quote is, there may be in some level of consciousness raising, attainment of civil rights, given the persistence, so the continuation of disenfranchisement, lynching, housing, left those facing the onslaught of Jim Crow wondering when this progress would finally catch up to them. So not enough is being done, according to Carol. And she's written books on Truman and civil rights, which I would encourage you to read. A very good, balanced opinion, but she's very critical of President Truman. On the other hand, we have Congressman John Lewis, infamous John Lewis, took place in the civil rights marches in the 1960s, spoke at the Truman Library, and he said during the 40s and the 50s, during the presidency of Harry Truman, all across the American South, segregation was the order of the day. The country had to change, and it's my belief that the actions of President Truman created the climate, created the environment, and laid the foundation for the modern American civil rights movement. So an excellent quote there. And then just to finish up, one quote from Harry Truman and one quote from the NAACP. It does not mean we have reached the goal, although we can stop working. Much remains to be done. So Truman admits that right before he leaves office. And then Roy Wilkins, Assistant Secretary of the National Council of Advancement of African Americans, as you leave the White House, you carry with you the gratitude and affectionate regard of millions who in less than a decade of your leadership, inspiration, and determination have seen the old order change before their eyes. So a nice quote to finish. So we race through that. We have about 8 minutes left, 7 minutes left. You have great questions all the way through, but I'd like to invite for more questions, discussion, observations, comments. Feel free to jump in the chat. Here we go. Since he drew a line between social and personal equality, how did his views on racial prejudice show up in his personal life? It's a really interesting question. I would argue, or I would say, in his social life at his own home, it would be rare that African Americans would be invited to his home in early retirement. Now, there are many um, programs and social events that he goes to with his African Americans there, and he doesn't seem to have an issue with it. But his own home, that seems to be more restricted. How does family feel about his civil rights efforts? Well, his father died in 1914, so he's kind of out of the picture before Truman even goes to World War One. His mother does live later in life, but she dies before most of these actions take place. His brother and sister um, have contrasting views about it. Some of his closest friends tell him he's gone wrong, and Truman usually sent them the report to secure these rights as his answer. How did he reflect on his civil rights policy after his presidency? Yeah, we got this question this morning too. He was very proud of it. He talks about it at length. He sees the actions of the 50s and 60s. He doesn't die until 1972. So he sees the 50s and 60s and the changes. And LBJ gives him lots of credit for putting him on the right path. And so I think he's quite proud of it. He did have some disagreements with Martin Luther King in some letters they wrote back and forth, but that seemed to be more about strategy than it was about anything else. But for the most part, he was very proud of his civil rights accomplishments. Did he? Did I think you mean did he work? Did he work with any civil rights activists after being president? Not that I'm aware of. He kind of went into retirement, wrote his memoirs, stayed out of political issues. He campaigned for candidates like Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 56 against Eisenhower, and for John F. Kennedy in 1960. And he was very good friends with Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson actually signed the Medicare legislation in our building with Truman standing next to him in our auditorium here. So Medicare legislation, he was proud of as well. But civil rights, he was very proud to see that, but he was not involved on the activist side of things. That was not in his nature on anything. He didn't really campaign for any causes. Once he retired, he didn't want to step on the toes of other presidents. What is my opinion? It's tricky to say as someone who works here. We try to be balanced and we like people to make up their own mind. But I think it's inarguable that he changed the landscape. He was the first to try, and he makes the first step, and then others are able to work from that. You certainly see the reaction, 80+% against him. When we see Brown v. Board and the Little Rock crisis in 1957 under the Eisenhower administration, you see the volatile, violent nature of the certain sections of society against advancement of opportunities for African Americans. So one of the teachers or one of the groups earlier mentioned that it was brave. I think it was brave. I think it was the first step. I think in hindsight, Dr. Anderson is right. He probably could have done more as well. But through no powers of the legislator, because they wouldn't vote for anything, he would have had to do more through more executive orders. And then they would have to stand up to the Supreme Court. So it's one probably historians will argue about for a long time. But I think he does make the first few steps along the way. And honestly, in 2024, we've still got steps to go, right? It's not over. We see the rise of Black Lives Matter and other causes, and we still have a long way to go to be a truly integrated society across the whole United States. Great question. We just have a couple of minutes for any final comments or questions. While you're thinking of those, I really want to thank you for your participation. It's been one of the best participated groups I've run, and I really appreciate your thoughtful answers, thoughtful questions, thoughtful discussion points. I hope you're able to take those back to the classroom and talk some more with the students about an issue that still resonates in 2024.
All right. Well, I just want to take a minute to thank everyone for attending. We really appreciate all your participation and your very thoughtful questions today. And Mark, thank you so much for your time and this great presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for signing up and appreciate your participation.